Sick of getting blisters? Stop slipping and just be comfortable with Pure Grip Socks Pro. Great fit, great comfort, lots of grip, and an even better price. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
Who makes the best control boots in 2024? Nike, Adidas, or Puma? With the least expensive of the bunch, although a boot that still does see a $20 price increase over the previous generation, the Puma Future 7 Ultimate is going to run you $240, which is still a decent price, but certainly not the $200 value that it once was a couple years ago. Moving up in price, but still with a couple different options, you have the Adidas Predator 30 Elite, this being the most expensive FT fold-over tongue variation, which is going to run you $280 at full retail. Not a fan of the tongue though, you can get the non-FT variation for $20 less at $260, and if you're into the laceless thing, those are going to run you $270. With Nike being the most expensive of the bunch, the mid-cut Phantom Luna 2 Elite is going to run you $295. However, if you're not into the collar, you can go for the low-cut GX2 Elite for $270. And given that all variations of any three of these boots will still perform at a very high standard, when it comes to price, Puma wins. All of which, by the way, you can get below their normal retail prices by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the links down below. If you're going to classify something as a control boot, touch is everything. And in the case of these three, it can really be broken down into three separate categories: some grip, targeted grip, and all grip. With the Future featuring both a mesh/knit based upper material with the signature grip or control element being their power print technology, which as you can see is made up of these little squares strategically scattered all across the upper, and then not in some very kind of high touch spots for whatever reason. It almost looks like the boots are balding, but nonetheless, there is a very significant grittiness across the entire foot, but no real stickiness, which is what you're going to find from the other two. So if I had to compare this to another boot on the market, it's reminiscent of what the Nike Phantom GT series once had on offer, but with definitely a softer, slightly more padded feel against your foot. If you like the idea of having some grip on the ball by way of friction without that sensation of stickiness, this is by far going to be the best option for you out of the three. Where the Predator is by label a control boot, but in reality kind of pays tribute to the power boot days of the Predator series, which I think makes for arguably the most unique experience out of all three boots that we're comparing in this video, in that you get this synthetic hybrid touch upper that is the most leather-like out of everything in the control category right now. Obviously, if you want a pair of leather boots, that's going to be the ultimate in terms of giving you that soft sensation. But what I like about this hybrid touch is it's structurally sound, it feels solid on your foot, but definitely isn't overly bulky. It's a football boot that feels like it has some substance, which is definitely not how you would describe the other two options in this video. And then of course you do get the rubber striking elements through the striking area of the foot, particularly on the medial side is where they're going to be noticeable when it comes to controlling the ball, passing the ball, and definitely when shooting. If you opt for the fold over tongue, you get some extra rubber elements right here on the tongue itself, and the grip provided by this rubber is super aggressive. If you want the most bite possible on the ball, this definitely delivers that, particularly when shooting, generating spin and the sensation of control from that extra grip, I think is just fantastic. And again, it's really what makes this particular boot feel so different, not just compared to other control boots, but pretty much everything that's currently on the market. Where the Phantoms can be described as wearing a pair of really grippy socks. The grip knit material is super soft, super pliable, no real structure to it in terms of how it feels and moves with your foot, which is very comfortable. They still feel secure and locked in with the laces tied tight, but the grip knit texture across the entirety of the upper, or at least the parts of the upper that are going to be consistently making contact with the ball, are super noticeable. It's not quite as much grip in terms of how it bites the ball when shooting as what you're going to find from the rubber elements on the Predator, but what's nice about these compared to the Preds and certainly the Futures is that the grip across the entire foot is very, very consistent. So if you like the idea of having extra grip and you want it absolutely everywhere, this would be the ideal choice. So obviously personal preference is going to be a huge factor in which type of feel you're going to like the best. However, when you're talking about what's going to provide the most unique experience, at least in my opinion, the Predator wins this category. When it comes to sole plates and stud patterns, while there are some definite differences, I actually don't think there's a lot that separates these three. With the Phantom somewhat controversially recycling last year's Luna sole plate and stud pattern, which admittedly kind of flexes in weird spots for a pair of high-end football boots, but ultimately is more on the flexible side and I think does work well with the upper, so I have no major complaints in regards to how it feels. And of course you are getting that Cyclone 360 layout in the forefoot, which is supposed to prioritize rotational movements while also giving you the most aggressive stud shape in the world of football boots. So I don't necessarily agree with that functionality. If the ground is really well kept and kind of on the softer side, it rotates nicely. On a harder surface and certainly on artificial grass, which you should never be wearing a firm ground stud pattern on, I just think if rotational movement was the priority, rounded studs definitely would have been the better way to go, but in terms of giving you plenty of bite in all directions, this bladed stud pattern works really well. Where the Control Frame 2.0 of the Predator is more or less Adidas going back to what they know works really well. Solid plastic sole plate, stiffener bars through the middle, external heel counter. It has a nice solid feel without being overly stiff, which I think is fitting for this style of football boot, and it's a stud pattern that if you've worn an Adidas boot since 2010, you probably know what to expect. A little bit more aggressive than you perhaps might expect, but also pretty much the same as every other boot with 3 stripes. Where the Puma sole plate and stud pattern, I might actually argue feels the most unique in terms of giving you these bladed studs that are oriented in kind of a more forward direction. So in terms of pushing off in a straight line, I feel like the bite is phenomenal from the Future Ultimate. The sole plate itself is solid while still feeling nice and flexible. And in general, if you're looking for aggressive traction, just like the other two, you're definitely going to get it here. So I'm tentative to say that this would be the winner in this particular category. But I guess if I could take any sole plate of these three and put them on one pair of football boots, I'd probably pick this one. If you're shopping in the control category of football boots, weight probably isn't a priority, but for the sake of information, let's find out which ones are the lightest and which ones are the heaviest, all in the same size 9.5 US. Spoiler alert, the heaviest of the bunch is the Future 7 Ultimate, weighing in at 8.1 ounces, the equivalent of 229 grams. Change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the middle one, which would be the Predator 30 Elite FT, weighing in at 7.8 ounces, the equivalent of 221 grams. Change that scale back to ounces one more time, and we'll throw on the Phantom Luna 2 Elite, which would be the heaviest version of the Phantom. They weigh in at 7.05 ounces, the equivalent of 201 grams. And of course, it must be said, the non-FT variation, as well as the laceless version of the Predator 30, would be a little bit lighter than this one right here. However, these two are pretty similar in weight, not heavy, but obviously not super light, where the Phantom, whether you go for the Luna or the Low Cut GX, is by far the lightest in this category. When it comes to fit and comfort, certainly the Phantom as well as the Future would be the two most comparable in this particular comparison, in that they are both kind of knit / textile based uppers with a one-piece construction. What I wasn't necessarily expecting is that they do actually end up fitting and feeling very similar to each other. The main difference you're going to find is that the Future inevitably ends up feeling more structured, particularly across the top of the foot, because of that Y-shaped power print. It just provides a lot of additional structure and more of a locked-in tight sensation than what you're going to find from the grip knit of the Phantom, which generally just feels more flexible and more sock-like. I would also argue that the sole plate on the Phantoms is a little bit more flexible and just less solid feeling than what you're going to find from the Futures. But in terms of overall comfort, it's really hard to separate the two. I think they're both very comfortable football boots. From a width perspective, they're actually pretty similar as well. Because there's less structure to the upper of the Phantoms, they do end up feeling a little bit wider through the midfoot and forefoot. However, they do pinch a little bit more in the toe box area versus what you're going to find from the Futures. So if you want a more structured feel, the Future is probably going to be the more comfortable boot for you. Whereas if you want something that just feels like a super soft pair of socks, you'll probably prefer the on-foot feel of the Phantoms. Where the Preds, in comparison, to say the least, are built different. They share none of the sock-like qualities of the other two, in that it's not a sock-like football boot in terms of its construction or the materials used. The Hybrid Touch upper, while it's supposed to mimic the feel of leather, and to a certain extent does feel more leather-like than some synthetic football boots, in general, it just has that sensation of being a little bit more structured and a little bit more padded than the vast majority of football boots out there, where typically synthetics these days trend on the side of being super, super thin and barefoot-like. These definitely aren't overly padded, but they're certainly not overly thin either, meaning that the feel on your foot ends up being a little bit more leather-like than most. The central tongue and lacing system really creates a traditional feel to this football boot that you just don't get very often anymore, that I would argue feels very comfortable, but at the end of the day, personal preference is going to play a huge role in what you determine to be comfortable. I think in the sense of being a pair of sock-like football boots, you'll probably find the Phantoms more comfortable, where if you are a little bit more of a traditionalist in terms of how you like your football boots to feel, you'll much prefer the construction that the Predator 30 has on offer. The sole plate definitely feels a little bit more solid again than what you're going to find from the Phantoms if you are comparing these two. And from a width perspective, I would say they have decent width all the way through, more so than the other two. But that is not to say that somebody with slightly narrower feet couldn't get away with wearing the Predators. I think overall the control category in general is pretty accommodating to a very wide variety of foot types, whether you have wide or narrow feet. But certainly from an adjustability standpoint, having that traditional U-throat construction with that standalone tongue does make these the most adjustable from a width perspective. So to pick a winner in this category, it's a little bit more difficult, but I'd say that if you're looking for something that has that more soft sock-like feel, the Phantoms would probably win, whereas if you do like that slightly more traditional football boot sensation, definitely the Preds. So after all that, how do they rank? Keeping in mind, these are all really good, and depending on your personal preferences, particularly as it relates to touch on the ball as well as fit and comfort, there is not a bad choice among any of these three. However, in third place, aka last, is the Puma Future 7 Ultimate. Again, it is not that this is a bad pair of football boots. In a lot of ways, I think these are actually better than both the Preds as well as the Phantoms. However, when it comes to giving you that special experience that I think is part of what you pay for from a pair of high-end football boots, it's not that these are bad, but they're just, dare I say, uninteresting. Don't get me wrong, if you're into the simple sock boot thing with some gritty texturing on the surface, they're pretty well perfect. But if you're spending the money on a pair of control boots with the expectation that they're gonna give you that little bit more from an experience standpoint, you probably shouldn't pick these. In second place is Nike. The Phantom overall is a great pair of football boots, whether you go for the mid-cut Luna 2 or the low-cut GX2. I don't think there's a bad choice between them. The grip provided by the Grip Knit upper is fantastic, and overall, the feel of this football boot is just really, really good. That sensation of all-over grip without any extra bulk or added rubber on the surface, I think makes the experience of playing in these really, really special. With that said, I'm not in love with the shape. I'm not in love with the sole plate and stud pattern. Not that I think it's bad, but I think had they carried over the GX1 sole plate and stud pattern, this would have been a better football boot overall. And the fact that they are more expensive, especially for the mid-cut Luna, than all the other options, I'm just not so sure that that's necessarily worth it. And I think that came off sounding more negative than it needed to be. This is a fantastic pair of football boots. I think the vast majority of people that purchase them will be really happy with the experience they have on offer. And certainly, if you like that all-over grip sensation, this would definitely be the best choice. Which of course means, in my opinion, the best control/power boot of 2024 is the Adidas Predator 30 Elite. The hybrid touch upper in combination with the rubber striking elements gives you that old school power boot feel without the old school power boot bulk. They fit incredibly well, they're lighter than you'd expect them to be. The option of a fold over flap tongue held down by an elastic strap is absolutely incredible, and for me, it's everything that's exciting about football boots from both a technology as well as a design perspective, all coming together to create what is genuinely the most unique pair of football boots that we've seen in quite a long time.